Hey, you're listening to TrueNorth Truck Talk, or the Triple T Pod for short. It's a monthly podcast hosted by Scopelitis Transportation Consulting and brought to you by TrueNorth Companies. In each episode, Steve Keppler and I will take a deep dive into all things trucking, like what's new in government and research, as well as practical and theoretical discussions on issues like the role of independent contractors, reducing risk within your business, and how to adapt to this crazy supply chain. Our carefully selected panel of industry experts get to the bottom of the most challenging and controversial issues facing the industry today. So without further ado, I'm Sean Garney.
And I'm Steve Keppler. Welcome to the show.
Well, hey, Steve, welcome back. Happy to be here on a warm January morning. It's 4 degrees currently in my location. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. The cold snap is hitting me right now. So don't have a lot of warm and fuzzies going into the weekend. Between that and new football this weekend, and my team being out of the playoffs, and I know yours is too. It's not looking good going into the weekend. So
yeah, we are not winning, but we'll keep working on it. Well, hey, I'm super excited for our show today. We're going to be talking about independent contractors. And as our listeners know, we've been tracking independent contractor issues here at STC for a long time and have experience helping fleets using the independent contractor model to fortify that model while improving operations and safety. We all know that independent contractors play an absolutely important role in our industry and represent critical capacity necessary to deliver our nation's freight. But also, as we know, the model occasionally does come under attack by opponents who argue that some independent contractors are misclassified and look a lot more like employees than independent business people. Managing this risk can be a full-time job, and tracking and adapting to the shifting landscape can be challenging. Last year, we saw significant federal and state action in the space as well, much of which may make our jobs more difficult in the future. Fortunately for us and our listeners, we have strong relationships with some of the brightest minds in the industry, and we've invited a couple of them to join us on the podcast today. The first is Chris Gulker, Principal and Practice Leader at TrueNorth. Chris oversees TrueNorth's asset-light practice, where he helps companies understand the nuances of independent contractor owner-operator model and helps companies protect and maximize their utilization of independent contractors. We're also pleased to welcome Greg Feary, President and Managing Partner of the renowned transportation law firm Scopelitis, Garvin, Hanson, and Feary. Greg is perhaps the preeminent legal expert in the field of independent contractors whose resume is miles and miles long. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you on our podcast.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Steve and Sean. Good to see you.
Good to be with you guys today. And I've got you beat, by the way. It's 1 degree where I'm at. So,
man.
Is that with or without the wind chill?
That's pure temperature. Wind chill's well below zero.
Oof.
Yikes. Maybe we should move to Indianapolis. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a warm 17 here.
Great. Well, hey, here to talk about independent contractors. I think probably the best place to start is with some of the latest breaking stories, particularly the Biden administration's publication of their new Department of Labor proposal on how to define independent contractors. Just hoping, Greg and Chris, if you can give us sort of a 10,000-foot overview of what exactly is in the proposal and maybe even some of what some 54,000 commenters might have said on the issue, which way they may have come down. So we'll just kick it off nice and easy like that.
Chris, if you want me to go first, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, fire away, Greg.
So the notice of proposed rule making was a 184-page document. I would say the vast majority of the document, or the proposed rule, I should say, addressed rescinding the Trump rule, the 2021 rule. And really a smaller part was the U.S. Department of Labor articulating, in effect, what they're saying is going back to the economic realities test that existed before the Trump rule. The Trump rule merged one of the 6 factors of the economic realities test and then created kind of a 2-level test where the first two levels, if those pointed in one direction or the other, you would never go to the last three. The economic realities test, just to remind your viewers, listeners,
please.
Is generally speaking a 6-factor test. It's the right of control. It's kind of the B prong, whether the work is integral to the putative employer's work or in the same trade, occupation, or profession. Whether there's an opportunity for profit or loss based on the exercise of management skill, whether the investment is relative to the putative employers is significant. So kind of translating that would be, do you have a significant investment compared to the motor carrier that you're under contract with, Mr. Owner Operator? Permanence of the relationship and the skill required for the independent contractor job. And so the Department of Labor is saying, we're going to go back to that. We've been doing that for the last 70 years. We're going to go back to that, and that's fine. Those factors are fine. It's what the Department of Labor, their interpretations of those factors that pose a real problem. And their interpretations, and I would just highlight 5 or 6 interpretations that cause us a lot of problems in the trucking industry. One would be that an investment in a tool is not a capital investment in the business, or may not necessarily be. So the argument might be this, and they actually even made reference to kind of the courier industry and personal vehicles. If you're a courier driver and you're using your own personal vehicle, well, there's no investment there, and the DOL wouldn't see that as a significant investment. Whether the DOL sees, a Class A truck as being a significant investment is another question.
I see it as a significant investment personally.
It certainly would be, right? You know of many, many small businesses in America that don't have that kind of startup investment. So it's a good point that you make, Sean. One that really has gotten a lot of attention, and I'll stop for a minute and just let Chris comment on, is this whole idea of the regulatory environment actually being a lens through which you interpret employment. Yeah. Now, for years and years, the courts have said that the regulatory environment in trucking is not probative because it applies the same way whether somebody's an employee driver or an independent contractor. Now, this DOL is saying, no, we're going to look at the regulatory environment and see if safety and legal regulations impose so much control that worker has to be an employee. And I'll pause for a minute because I'm sure Chris has gotten a fair amount of questions on that in his job.
Yeah, I guess, from my vantage point, guys, I've been around this conversation and in the business for 10 years. And what's maybe most striking to me is the conversation hasn't really changed materially over the last 10 years. And what I mean by that is the independent contractor model is continuously under attack. And whether it's the Department of Labor or a specific state agency in a specific state environment, this problem of balancing what some federal or state level government wants to dictate around the utilization of independent contractors, it's always been an issue. Longer than I've been in the business, certainly. And candidly is probably not going anywhere. It kind of is what it is. And I hate to be so negative about it, but whether it's this particular problem or the next one, what's most striking to me though, is, you look at the landscape in the trucking, transportation, logistics industry, and I don't have the data in front of me, but there's somewhere around 3.5, 4 million CDL drivers driving commercial Class A trucks, of which the numbers vary between maybe 350,000 to maybe 500,000 of those are owner operators. Everybody in the industry, in addition to the independent contractor status regulations, everybody's talking about the driver shortage. That's been the other big ticket item that, again, in my 10 years has continually been focused on. And so what really frustrates me personally is looking at those statistics and saying there's 10 to 1 company drivers versus independent contractors. There's this national driver shortage, yet we've got governments coming in and saying, hey, Mr. Owner Operator, your business model isn't legit. You're actually an employee. We're going to reclassify you. When the reality is, my guess, again, there's no data behind this that I'm aware of, 90+% of them, my guess would be, are classified the right way. They're truly owner operators. They want to be entrepreneurs. They want to grow a business. And it's not fair to them to have somebody come in and say, no, that's not allowed. You're running an illegal business.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I know Atree's done some research on this to look at kind of the current ICs that are out there today, and they've indicated that about 3/4 of them, if they had to change status, they would have a job, job satisfaction would plummet, and they also would make less money, almost the same amount. So clearly it would impact them. And Greg, I think back to something you mentioned about the whole with this rule and the issue of control and particularly with types of technology. So what, obviously that's a potential for impacting on safety. Any thoughts? And the other thing that's related, as you're mentioning that, I'm thinking to myself is, if this moves forward, how would it would run counter to FMCSA regulations in many respects. So how do you square those two things, right? So who's on first?
So you raise maybe the most alarming point outside this whole misclassification issue. And I reasoned through it this way: when the DOL pushed out this proposed rule, one of their comments was, there's a lot of technology that's being applied in the transportation industry. And we're going to look at technology and see if it's a lever of control. And, both you and Sean know very well that a vast majority of the technology in trucking is not mandated by the government. It's people trying to implement technology to create a safer environment. The vast majority of trucking are small trucking companies that are on the fence as to whether they can afford that technology, but I think they feel like they can't afford to be without it. And Chris has good insight. You guys focusing on safety, a lot have great insight. So now you're sitting there as a smallish trucking company trying to decide whether you're going to invest in a forward-facing camera, certainly not required by law. And the U.S. government comes out and says, well, we're not so sure that camera might not be a lever that allows you to control these workers who are really employees. And what you're doing is this insidious control through technology. If I'm a small trucking company, kind of hard to even gather up the capital investment to do it, but I think it's worth it for a lot of reasons. And then all of a sudden I hear, but the government's going to come in and reclassify all these workers as employees. I'm not sure I make the investment. And that's what's really discouraging.
Yeah, and I imagine, Chris, you're hearing sort of similar things when, especially from your side of the aisle, where folks are really trying to improve safety, but are unsure what investments are appropriate or best. How do you counsel those clients that come to you and ask you about safety technology?
It's a sticky situation. Greg summarized it well. It's a little bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation where for a motor carrier, you've got this decision of do I want to be truly best in class from a safety perspective and deploy the latest technology that can frankly help save lives, or do I want to appease the regulatory bodies,
Right.
plaintiffs' attorneys, who say, no, by implementing that technology, you're their employer. So how are we advising? Actually going back probably 3.5, 4 years, we had a large client approach us actually as they were navigating these waters and trying to identify big company driver fleet, big independent contractor fleet. How do they manage, how do they deploy a safety culture that is as close to what they do on the company driver side as they do in the independent contractor space? And that's a tricky question to answer because, Greg would tell you, you want to keep those operations as separate as possible. You don't want them to look like each other because they need to be distinct and different because they're different types of business interactions. So we've actually been able to innovate in that space and develop some of the kind of coaching and we don't call it coaching for IC status purposes, but we all know what we're talking about there, knowledge transfer for independent contractors that we can actually tie to the insurance programs. Mm-hmm. That gives us an opportunity to be, the offender, if you will. It's tied to the insurance solution. Becomes voluntary for contractors, but we're able to tie insurance incentives to participation where we see pretty significant a take rate because at the end of the day, if we can increase that contractor's bottom line by doing some just really base level kind of safety, if you will, whether that be LMS, knowledge transfer, video training, that sort of thing, kind of event-based, coaching as well. It makes everybody better, and ultimately the end goal is, obviously the savings that you see from an insurance perspective are nice, but I've never talked to a trucking executive that's their motive. It's always keeping people on the road safe.
Well, and I think picking up on that point, I think in the proposal, there's reference to this whole notion of managerial control, right? So, and, Sean and I deal with a lot of carriers and a lot of suppliers. And to your point, Chris, this whole notion of coaching and safety culture is paramount to it goes much beyond compliance, right? That safe operations is really clearly those that have that culture are making a difference. And I don't know from your guys' reading of the proposal, how would this piece of it impact on that potential portion of how a fleet manages its ICs versus its employee drivers?
The Department of Labor makes reference to the Scantland case as if it is the majority view of this issue, and it really is not the majority view of this issue. It's a surprising legal authoritative reference within the comments by the DOL, and that cases stands for the proposition that you don't disregard the regulatory and legal environment when interpreting whether a worker is classified properly. And yet the legion of cases in trucking go just the other way. And, so one, it feels like the Department of Labor, at least vis-a-vis trucking and transportation, is out of step. Secondly, back to this technology issue and the Department of Labor to some degree feeling as though it's out of step, at least with regard to transportation. And I know you both know this. There are 7 states now that have passed laws that specifically, and these are all new laws in the last 3 or 4 years. I'm sorry to be kind of an infomercial, but my partner Prasad Sharma, who
take a victory lap. This has been awesome work on behalf of the industry, I say.
Former ATA chief counsel, it was his brainchild to create these statutes that exempt safety technology from being interpreted as controlling the driver. And the states of Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, Indiana, Mississippi, Arizona, and then West Virginia, which the American Trucking Association had a big hand in. West Virginia's is more of a general law. The other 6 that I mentioned are trucking specific, are all moving in the opposite direction of what the DOL has in its comments. Again, at least with regard to transportation, the DOL doesn't seem to be directionally accurate at least in the way we think this issue should be understood. A couple of other issues come up that we mentioned at the onset. Relative investment. If you're going to compare a motor carrier's investment to a one-man truck driver's investment, I'm not sure how you could ever use that as a favorable factor towards supporting independent contractor status, depending on how you look at it. And the comments from the DOL, again, feel directionally inaccurate. Permanence of the work. This is a page out of David Weil's playbook. David Weil was in the Obama administration the chief of the wage and hour division of the US DOL. He sent out guidance memos saying, how could you possibly be an independent contractor if you're only working for one company? Well, a lot of American businesses are focused on building a good, solid relationship with one company. It's a small business. I'm not sure that becomes probative at all, but the Department of Labor has latched onto that. And then finally, the Department of Labor said working more as a way of making more money is not good. It doesn't show sufficient independence or managerial decision making. Well, in trucking, it kind of does, because as you pick the loads you want to take, and as you work more, you're making decisions that will determine whether you're going to be profitable or not. You have to choose the right load. Sometimes you don't, and you can lose. And you choose more of the right loads, and you're going to make more money. So, to me, it feels, at least and remember, the Department of Labor's comments and the rule is a broad rule intended to apply to all industries across America. Right. And while we're not overly optimistic that the final rule will come out substantially different than the proposed rule, in part, I'm not optimistic because the Biden administration's charted a course that final rule come out sometime by the end of May. And you made the comment, Sean. I think you were being your count was a little short. I think the number of comments was over 55,000.
Oh, yeah.
And it's inconceivable to me that the Department of Labor would do justice in understanding what those comments are and pushing out a rule by May. That seems right. And I think bound for lawsuits.
Well, certainly.
Well, I think that sorry, Steve. I think a few things that you said were pretty interesting. I mean, I think one of the best ways to make more money is to work harder and longer. So I'll just make that statement. We've been kind of dancing around the issue of politics a little bit. And, it's interesting that the Biden administration says, we're just going back to those 6 factors, but we're interpreting them in a little bit different of a way. And rescinding what Trump had done. And we talked about sort of the states and what the states are doing. And we have 7 states that are helping us with safety technology, but then still other states that are doing totally different things. But there's obviously like a line of demarcation, it seems like, on where people fall on the independent contractor issue. Why do you think it's come to that? And then how do we as an industry sort of anticipate? I mean, because in 2 years we could have a new president from the other party, and then now we've got to sort of expect something new again and adapt. And Chris made the great point earlier about, hey, we're going to keep marching on, but this causes a lot of stress, and there's a lot of carriers working really hard to stay on top of that, contacting us every day, contacting you guys every day, about how to stay straight. So What can we expect from the political landscape, and is it predictable?
So I'll comment on what Chris said earlier. In his 10 years of looking at this, it seems to have gotten not much traction in one direction or the other. I'm paraphrasing what he says, and although I know I look like Chris's contemporary, I actually have 35 years of doing this work, and I have the same viewpoint that Chris does. There's not a lot of traction in one direction or the other. It ebbs and flows, and I think the chief reason is what you said, Sean, because so much of the issue is rooted in political wins. I mean, when you look at it across the United States on a state-by-state basis, generally red states support entrepreneurism and the laws tend to favor independent contractor status. Blue states I tend to look at the issues more paternally in protecting the worker. There's lots of other forces at play. There's organized labor, the trial attorneys, on it goes. So the tensions are always there. And it's funny when you said in 2 years we may have a new president. I'd say the best agency, or the worst, to look at is the National Labor Relations Board.
Yeah.
You can see the decisions out of the NLRB in their 5-person committee board. When it's 3 to the Democrat side, the decisions go vastly in that direction, paternalism. When it's 3 to the Republican side, they go vastly towards entrepreneurism, and they go back and forth. And I'll tell you, probably the hardest job in America is to be a labor attorney, trying to figure out at any one time what advice you're going to give and how long that advice will remain solid advice upon which businesses will make investments and decisions. So I'll stop and let Chris comment.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that conversation. Personally, I think it's sad how political it is. Maybe I'm showing my cards too much here, but in the perfect world, I think, allow a business to operate the way they feel is right within laws that make sense. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any industry in the U.S. that better embodies the spirit of entrepreneurism and, frankly, the pursuit of the American dream. I mean, I'm sure you guys could all name at least 5 or 10 or 20 large trucking companies that started with a single owner operator, a single independent contractor. I could tell you countless stories. I've got stories, clients that are immigrants. They came here driving a truck, became an owner operator, decided to buy a second truck, and now they're companies that are worth, hundreds of millions of dollars. And I don't know another industry that has that type of opportunity, at least not to the same degree as within trucking. And yeah, to the comment made earlier, $150,000 investment or $100,000, whatever the price of a new or used truck is, not a low barrier to entry. That's a meaningful investment. You can't start a franchise, or you could start a franchise for much, much less than that, and that's considered a bona fide business. Yet $100,000+ investment isn't. That's a head scratcher for me, guys.
Well, I think just following up on that, I think, Greg, you're 35 years and Chris, you're 10. I mean, it seems like this is a constant conversation, the ebb and flow. Is this action by DOL, is it any different? And so with this new federal push, assuming that we have some type of rule that's similar to the proposal, how is that going to impact on the states? And it seems to me we're going to have more consternation and more potential litigation, more challenges, more things to figure out. So, and how's a carrier supposed to kind of figure all this stuff out, and what's the path forward?
Yeah, and I just want to, I love that question because it's been in my brain. We have something from the Department of Labor, a federal agency who's trying to help us define what an independent contractor is. So I'm thinking about that as a carrier. what is their authority, and how does that balance or is replaced by what's happening in other states, California, New Jersey, whatever the state is? Where's our target? Where do we keep our eyes, when we're trying to fortify our independent contractor model? Great questions.
Yeah, maybe we level set. Remember that the Department of Labor, with regard to this proposed rule, is applying to the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, the state laws that address wage and hour and the federal laws that address wage and hour apply co-equally. So you're really dealing with two sets of very similar laws. Certainly, we know in California, AB 5 is now the law of the land and generally applies to wage and hour laws in the state of California, while this economic realities test that the Department of Labor will push out a rule under will also apply. You're correct, Sean. It's going to be pretty complex. I'd say the one significant issue to place all of this in context, if you're operating on an interstate basis, crossing state lines, and operating vehicles in excess of 10,000 pounds, you're, in most instances, at least under the FLSA, you're going to be have a motor carrier exemption for overtime. So the issue you'll contend with is minimum wage. For vehicles that are not interstate or vehicles that are smaller than 10,001 pounds, you don't have that motor carrier exemption. And so now, for example, the courier industry would have both overtime and minimum wage to be concerned about under the FLSA. It is a patchwork quilt of laws. The laws are different under workers' comp. They're different under unemployment tax. There are special laws like the Illinois Wage Protection Act, and the National Labor Relations Act has under it the potential for the PRO Act, although I think that, from what I can tell, is somewhat dead in the water. That, by the way, that PRO Act does have an ABC test in it, just like AB 5. Again, I don't think that's going to be is going to see the light of day anytime soon. So bottom line is it's kind of what Chris said. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot of trying to thread the needle as a trucking business to make sure you're not in court, you're not, paying trial attorneys a lot of money and everybody else who's got their hand out on this issue, trying to stay as low profile as you can, try to do everything right if it's possible. And I certainly know that a lot of attention has been put on over the last, certainly since August when AB 5's injunction was lifted. That has become a big attention getter for the trucking industry.
It's enough to make your head explode. Make sure you get a good lawyer, right?
We might know a few.
Yeah.
One whose head has not yet exploded yet.
Chris, when we were thinking about this podcast a little bit, and one of our goals here, I think on the Triple T Pod is to try to provide motor carriers with sort of actionable intel or advice. With you've been in this 10 years, we're going to keep the pace. What are you telling your carriers when they're calling and asking about this, when they're concerned about their model, or maybe they're asking you, can you come take a look at what we're doing and provide us some recommendations? What are sort of the guiding principles that you're offering them? I know one that is a little in question now is, if the government's requiring it, then that could be a safe harbor for you. Maybe you just have 2 or 3 things that carriers, guiding principles carriers should focus on when thinking about independent contractor status.
Yeah, guys, I'm a firm believer the independent contractor model is here to stay. I think it's such a cornerstone to the industry. I think hell or high water, it's going to be around for the long run. So I from that perspective, I'm optimistic. That said, great question, Sean. As we've got kind of a mantra here at True North, we've never walked into a transportation company and talked to a suite of executives who's raised their hand and said, hey, you know what? I'm overstaffed in safety, risk, or compliance. And so to that end,
That's so true.
that's where you tap into partners, right?
Yes.
Establish partnerships with people who know what they're doing, that have the ability to make recommendations and really support those risk strategies. So as self-serving as this sounds, it's not intended to be. I think the number one piece of advice is really do an audit of your independent contractor model. Whether that's a review of your independent contractor agreement, your ICOA, and ensuring that's been written by a high quality law firm like Scopelitis, working with consultants like you guys at STC, doing IC do's and don'ts training. It's remarkable. It's uncanny. We've worked with a lot of really, really large, highly sophisticated, very in tune with risk type motor carriers who have largely turned a blind eye to independent contractor status risk. And they've got internal and external documentation that looks and talks and smells a lot like an employee model. They've got great intentions, but sometimes it's just that 101 level kind of base execution that can be some of the smoke that, hey, you know what, some plaintiff's attorney or some state agency smells, and all of a sudden that smoke turns into a big fire and you've got a pretty expensive lawsuit on your hands. So I think that just honest assessment, whether you can pull that off internally or you pull in some quality partners, I think is honestly the best piece of advice.
Greg, you have any thoughts to follow up there with Chris?
Wow, I would be silly not to agree with Chris and say, get good advisors. And I think True North is in that highest caliber of insurance broker advisor beyond just the purchase of insurance. That's not necessarily where their sweet spot is just selling a product. They're selling a relationship and advice. But I can let Chris speak to that. Obviously, Scopelitis, we take a lot of pride in what we do and being excellent at it. And our clients take a lot of pride in what they do and being excellent at it. And what they do is to reduce it to something probably more elemental than I should, is pick up and deliver goods and do it safely and on time and carefully. And they do generally rely on allied industry experts to tell them, okay, how you do this and how you, as I said earlier, thread the needle and do it in a way that's economically prudent, that follows all the laws, is done the right way, so that you can be one of those success stories that you guys mentioned. And, and I will say this, there are, I can rattle off a number of companies that started with one truck, just like we all can. Watkins Motor Lines that sold to FedEx. I think J.B. Hunt started with one or two trucks. Grable Van Lines, on it goes. But there's a lot of companies out there that started with one truck and 10 years later are at two trucks, and that's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. They're small businesses, and that's what they want. They want to make a living. They want to be independent. And Sean, you made the point earlier, and actually there was a recent Fox News article that came out of a woman who basically said AB5 is putting me out of business. I think I'm really good at what I do, and I started.
She had to move to Missouri.
Yeah, California's told me I'm not a business anymore.
Yeah.
And it's sad to see those reports, but the point that, Chris, you made the 90-10 or what, it may even be more substantial than that, that such a small percentage of the driver workforce are contractors. If you want to be an employee driver, there's lots and lots and lots of opportunities. If you want to be a contractor, it starts with a big investment in a truck. It starts with business acumen. It starts with a lot of things that are higher hurdles. So if you really want to do that, it's very, very intentional in both directions.
You'd think that, just to editorialize a little bit, with all the challenges we've had in the supply chain the last couple of years, that it seems like DOL is being a little tone deaf right here, and understanding how important transportation is to our economy and our quality of life. And so it's a bit unfortunate that that's the case for sure, I think.
And then we haven't even mentioned this. You guys, all three of you have a greater grasp of it than I do. We've got an aging truck driver workforce. I'm going to guess the average age is north of 50 at this point. And so if you think that, I'm speaking as someone in his 60s, is it logical to think that if you're faced with these types of laws and you say, it's really not worth it for me to do this anymore. I was going to retire in 2 or 3 years. I think I'm going to retire right now. And if you get enough of those people making that decision, how does that help your driver shortage? How does that help your supply chain? If we go into another pandemic where we're relying completely on the transportation industry to keep us running from day to day at our households. And in the big middle of this, the federal government and the Department of Labor is one, the National Labor Relations Board is another, the IRS possibly is a third, are making it more and more difficult for drivers to stay in the business. So the younger ones pivoting to something else that's more fun to do, and the older ones saying it's just not worth the effort. It does seem like government is tone deaf on this issue.
Yeah.
Well, and we've got to be winding down here because we're moving on time, but I want to give everybody some parting shots here. And Greg, I'm going to tee this one up for you because I was there when you presented at MC&E, and you reflected on a story. You were on a panel, and one of the attorneys at one point had said to you after AB5, like, hey, haven't you lost? Like, why don't, isn't it over now? Why don't you just all make all your drivers employee drivers? Wondering if you'd be willing to share your response to that, because I think it fits in your comments.
I want to be careful not to indict the other person that was in that conversation, but the gist of it was the presumption is you get to go to this driver workforce and say, you over there who call yourself an independent contractor, you're going to be an employee, and you presume they'll say, oh, okay. When they may say, no, thank you. That's not why I'm doing what I'm doing. And Chris's earlier point is, if he's right, and I think he's certainly close to right, if not exactly right, 90 out of 100 of them are going to say, no, thank you. If you're going to call me an employee, I'm going to call myself out of here. I'm going somewhere else where I can be an independent contractor. Right. And by the way, that was the point that the CTA made in CTA versus Bonta in a filing made in mid-January to request another injunction of AB5. They basically, and I think well stated, said this is all built on a presumption that these workers want to be employees, and that's just not true. So that's my parting shot. I'll let Chris.
Yeah, I like that. Chris, what do you say to all the independent contractors out there?
Like I said earlier, I think the IC model's here to stay. We are wildly passionate about the independent contractor model and fierce advocates for it. Whether that be, association involvement, advocacy, et cetera, it runs through our blood in all honesty. So if I were to talk to an independent contractor, if we've got a group of ICs listening now, I'd say, stay true to it. I think it might be an uphill battle at times, but I think we're here to stay.
Great. Steve, final thoughts, and you want to roll us out of here? Appreciate everybody today.
Sure. Well, I think, one of the things Sean and I talked about going into this year is we think we need to focus more on the driver, right? For many, many years, we've treated them like a commodity, right? And this action seems to put them in a hole that they may not fit in. And frankly, it's their choice. We ought to give them that choice, and we need to treat them. They're the most important asset to the trucking company. And so we need to make sure they're happy, and we need to do whatever we can to make them successful. And I think that ought to be our model moving forward. And Chris, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's here to stay. I think we got some challenges, but it's the American way. So, and I'm fully behind that. So I think, to wrap up here, thanks to Greg and Chris for your time today. We really appreciate it. And thanks to our listeners for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the Triple T Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know what topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@TrueNorthCompanies.com. Thank you very much, Sean. Thanks for hosting, being a great host you always are. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, all. Hope it warms up wherever you're at.
Right.